The Last Day, Wrath, Ruin, and Reason in the Great Lisbon Earthquake of 1755 by Nicholas Shrady. Narrated by Patrick Lawlor. Copyright 2008 by Nicholas Shrady. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with Nicholas Shrady and Fletcher and Perry, and was produced in the year 2008 by Tantor Media Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. Later, when the earth had ceased to tremble and a fine dust of ages had settled over Lisbon like a shroud, when the sea had spilled back into the placid expanse of the Tagus estuary, and the last embers of an all-consuming fire had been extinguished, only then would the survivors come to dwell on the prophecies. For as long as anyone could remember, soothsayers and diviners, pamphleteers and prognosticators, clerics and ascetics had been preaching unequivocal doom for the Portuguese capital. The signs and portents, they insisted, were varied if unmistakable: a rash of stillborn infants, a comet streaking the heavens, the feverish dreams of a cloistered nun, a vision of avenging angels hovering over the city, and they all pointed to Lisbon's destruction at the hands of a wrathful god. The admonitions had Lisbon expiring variously by drought, plague, famine, invasion, earthquakes, tempests, a proliferation of vermin, and the return of the Spanish overlords. But the most common chastisement was always by flood, as for Noah, or fire, as for Sodom. From the pulpits came a torrent of sermons that took the city to task for a litany of sins. Never mind that the Portuguese were demonstrably devout, pious beyond reason, and the staunch guardians of an arch-Roman Catholicism. Lisbon, railed a zealous clergy, had become steeped in iniquity, and its people mired in moral turpitude through the triumph of wantonness, greed, sloth, corruption, and, worst of all, the venal proximity of heretical foreign Protestants. The days of reckoning were close at hand. Woe to those who failed to heed the call to repentance. And then the preachers cited liberally from the book of the Apocalypse. Alas, alas, thou great city, thou mighty city Babylon, in 1 hour has thy judgment come. Alas, alas, for the great city that was clothed in fine linen, in purple and scarlet, bedecked with gold, with jewels, and with pearls. In 1 hour all this wealth has been laid waste. This is what people would remember, the Apocalypse, for that is what the first days of November resembled more than anything else, as earth, sea, and fire conspired to lay waste to Lisbon. Chapter 1. All Saints' Day. They had scarcely set foot in the town, Lisbon, when they felt the earth tremble under their feet. The sea rose in foaming masses in the port, and smashed the ships which rode at anchor. Whirlwinds of flame and ashes covered the streets and squares. The houses collapsed, the roofs were thrown upon the foundations, and the foundations were scattered. 30,000 inhabitants of every age and sex were crushed under the ruins. "What can be the sufficient reason for this phenomenon?" said Pangloss. "It is the last day," cried Candide. François-Marie Arouet, Voltaire. Candide, or Optimism. It was the 1st of November, 1755. All Saints' Day dawned crisp and cloudless, and white stone Lisbon lay mantled in a keen autumnal light that cast elongated shadows from the summits of the surrounding hills to the banks of the river Tagus. A faint northeast breeze carried ribbons of chimney smoke from the cooking fires warming the kitchens of the city, spiraling aloft into a cerulean sky, and caused the standards raised on the battlements of the 10th century Moorish-built Castillo de São Jorge, which kept vigil over Lisbon, to scarcely waver. In the harbor, formidable Portuguese men-of-war and frigates, their gun portholes latched, and a flotilla of merchant ships flying flags from England, the Netherlands, France, Spain, Denmark, Malta, Venice, and Hamburg bobbed faintly on limpid waters. To even the most jaundiced observer, Lisbon seemed like a place blessed. It was blessed geography, in fact, that had given rise to Lisbon. Spread over 7 verdant hills on the northern shore of the Tagus, close to the Atlantic but sheltered from the open sea, and backed by the jagged peaks of Sintra, the beauty of the place was already grasped by the Phoenicians, who first settled the area around 1000 B.C. Greeks and later Carthaginians established trading communities here, and later still, the Romans elevated Olisipo, as they called the port, to a municipium. The Visigoths made it a citadel, as did the Moors. By the time Lisbon became the capital of a fledgling Portugal in 1260, the city already possessed a downright hoary past. But it was the advent of overseas conquest, exploration, and trade during the 15th and 16th centuries, the so-called Age of Discovery, that gave Lisbon the air of one of Europe's most opulent and vibrant capitals. Explorers such as Prince Henry the Navigator, Vasco da Gama, and scores of other intrepid mariners set sail from Lisbon on their imperial voyages for God, glory, and gold. Not necessarily in that order, and it was to Lisbon's quays that they returned from Asia, Africa, and Brazil, laden with the exotic fruits of an empire, including spices, gold, rare woods, arms, sugar, tobacco, and, infamously, West African slaves. When a veritable motherlode of gold and profuse diamond deposits were discovered in Brazil at the end of the 17th century, a good many contemporaries believed that the Portuguese had stumbled upon the true El Dorado. Portugal, a country that was diminutive, geographically remote, and almost wholly agricultural, became justly renowned for its guilt. "Merchants who have lived in Portugal inform us," wrote John Wesley, the English divine and founder of Methodism, "that the king had a large building filled with diamonds, and more gold stored up, coined and uncoined, than all the other princes of Europe together." Despite the splendid, if ill-gotten bounty of an empire, however, by the middle of the 18th century most of Portugal was still wallowing in nearly medieval destitution. King João V, who fancied himself a Portuguese version of Louis XIV, Le Roi Soleil, was entitled to his royal fifth of all gold and diamonds, and he lavished the treasure on the Catholic Church and the royal family. The Portuguese nobility wielded most of the monopolies on imports, and foreign merchants, most notably the British, controlled the lion's share of the highly profitable re-export market. The goldsmiths of Italy and the diamond cutters of the Netherlands gained more from the treasures of Brazil than any Portuguese. Had Portugal fostered a true merchant class and emergent industries, as did, for example, their diligent Dutch rivals, the country would have thrived. But as it was, Portugal was unable to adequately feed and clothe the populace from its own resources, and was obliged to import, among other necessities, wheat, cloth, and, astonishingly, fish. It didn't seem to matter, not as long as the Brazilian bonanza continued unabated. Portuguese colonial possessions stretched from Brazil to Macau, but Lisbon was the de facto capital and nerve center of this overextended empire. By 1750, the city's population had grown to 250,000, and the port was one of the busiest in Europe. But Lisbon was in irreversible decline. The rapacity of the crown, the nobility, and the foreign merchants prevented much trickling down of revenues from foreign trade and commerce. Industry was almost non-existent, and the general level of education was so low that clerks and accountants had to be imported from abroad to work in the great trading companies. The city had its fair share of palaces and noble residences built of a pristine white stone for which Lisbon was famous, but the majority of the people lived in rather cramped quarters in approximately 20,000 mostly ramshackle houses of adobe, brick, and wood. Some of the streets were cobbled, others unpaved, but all were routinely sullied with the refuse that the inhabitants were accustomed to tossing from their windows. Indeed, public sanitation had been better under the Romans and the Moors. To dodge the filth, the well-to-do were borne about in sedan chairs. At nightfall, the city gates were closed, and few ventured out into the unlit and unpoliced streets. Those who did were likely to tuck a pistol or a dagger beneath their knee-length capes. Still, for all these blemishes and shortcomings, life in Lisbon was remarkably agreeable, especially by 18th century standards. Although summers could be stifling, the climate was generally mild and wholesome. The city was surrounded by farms, vineyards, and orchards that provided fresh produce for the central market, which was adorned with brilliant azulejo tiles and reputed to be immaculately clean. Red wine was cheap, if a bit rough, and sardines, a Portuguese staple, were plentiful. There was opera for the noble and patrician classes, and more bawdy theatre for the commoners. But a stroll in the emblematic Rossio Square was a diversion enjoyed by all. Religious feasts and festivals marked the calendar, and provided a sense of cohesion and continuity to everyone save the city's beleaguered Jews and Muslims. Foreign visitors were apt to describe Lisbon as an African city on account of the preponderance of slaves and immigrants from Portugal's colonies in Brazil and Paraguay, Mozambique and Angola, the Azores and Goa, Macau and Malacca. But slaves notwithstanding, the racial mix gave Lisbon a patina of worldliness. Many Portuguese may have still regarded themselves flatteringly in the mirror of the times as the heroic descendants of the great mariners, a race that God had blessed with the gifts and rewards of discovery. But in truth it had been centuries since Portugal had discovered much more than loot. And the new revelations of the Enlightenment that were captivating the rest of Europe, that is to say, empiricism, the inductive method, and a pronounced hostility toward religious superstition, and that were the true discoveries of the times, had been all but stifled in Portugal by a powerful and archaic Catholic Church. In a popular travel guide from the period entitled Description de la ville de Lisbon, published anonymously in Paris in 1730, the author provided a sobering portrait of the locals. The Portuguese are large, well-built, and robust, but most of them are rather indolent, partly because of the climate, and still more because of the intermixture with blacks, which is quite common. They are jealous to the highest degree, secretive, vengeful, sarcastic, vain, and presumptuous without cause, since most of them have only a very mediocre education. They are also faithful friends, generous, charitable. But what most struck the author of the description, and nearly every other first-time traveler to Lisbon, was the unparalleled piety of the inhabitants. From the pulpit, Lisbon's clergy were forever portraying the city as a sink of iniquity, but these were the splenetic words of God-fearing churchmen, and hardly the true stamp of the city. If the sheer quantity of sanctified venues was the measure, Lisbon seemed the closest one could come to an earthly city of God. In addition to the 12th century patriarchal cathedral, Lisbon counted more than 40 parish churches, several non-parochial churches, 121 oratories, 90 convents, and close to 150 assorted religious brotherhoods and societies. In Lisbon, spires rose like copses of trees, and domes and cupolas resembled lofty hillocks. It was an ecclesiastical geography centuries in the making, a landscape of piety and devotion that marked the social and spiritual life of its inhabitants. Indeed, one could hardly take a step in the city without encountering a church, a wayside cross, a saintly shrine, or a Madonna rendered in polychrome azulejos. Note: upon arrival in the port of Lisbon, foreign ship captains were obliged to sign an oath, pledging that they and their crew would doff their hats when meeting men of the cloth, kneel at every elevation of the host, and in no way insult the cross wherever set up by making water, but however urgent their necessities may be, will retain the same till a proper and lawful distance. Religious processions of penitents were commonplace. The worship of sacred relics, often of dubious provenance, was widespread, and miraculous tales of divine intervention, saintly guidance, and prayers ineffably fulfilled were part of the public record. Of a population of approximately 250,000, more than 10% of Lisbon's residents were members of a religious order. Note: in all of Portugal, the clergy numbered roughly 200,000 out of a population of 3 million, making it more priest-ridden than any other country in the world with the possible exception of Tibet, according to the historian Charles Boxer. And while King José I, who bore the title of Fidelissimus, or Most Faithful, was considered to embody a measure of the divine and ruled over an absolute monarchy, Portugal often resembled nothing so much as a well-entrenched theocracy. The Catholic Church, the country's oldest institution and its principal land and property owner, wielded a monopoly on education, the confessional, hospitals, and the tribunals of the justly feared Holy Office of the Inquisition. That is to say, knowledge, conscience, health, and ecclesiastical law, and ostensibly ruled the life of the average Portuguese subject. To foreign visitors and residents, especially Protestants and those of a more enlightened bent, the rites and rituals of the Portuguese smacked of popery, idol worship, and inveterate superstition, and inspired reactions ranging from mockery to general loathing. In the spring of 1753, George Whitefield, the tireless evangelist of the great Methodist awakening in Britain, found himself waylaid in Lisbon with 22 orphans in tow, while en route to a preaching stint in colonial Georgia. In letters to his Methodist brethren in London, Whitefield described with undisguised revulsion some of the religious ceremonies to which he was a witness. One night, about 10 o'clock, I saw a train of near 200 penitents making a halt and kneeling in the street, whilst a friar from a high cross with a crucifix in his hand was preaching to them and the populace with great vehemence. As the procession made its way through the night-veiled streets, the penitents lashed themselves with whips and chains, beat their breasts in lament, and chanted "Penitentia." All were barefooted, Whitefield wrote, and all had long, heavy chains fastened to their ankles, which, when dragged along the street, made a dismal rattling. Whitefield's response to such a medieval scene of self-mortification was thoroughly apt. "Oh, happy England," he concluded. "Oh, happy Methodists." While a good deal of such public veneration was exceedingly palpable, if not inescapable, not all of it sprang from a pureness of the Christian heart. Throughout Portugal, religious observance was, for all intents and purposes, mandatory, since non-compliance, a failure to attend Mass or a disregard for the Sabbath and the prescribed holy days, could be denounced before the Inquisition. And lest anyone think to ignore or contradict unequivocal Catholic dogma, the Inquisition's spectacular show trials and autos de fe were incentive enough to maintain a conspicuous public faith. Note: the term auto de fe, also auto de fe, meaning an act of faith, was coined by the Portuguese and refers to the ceremony in which sentences of the Holy Office of the Inquisition were read and executed. The impenitent could be condemned to prison, torture, or, in the case of the most grievous sins against the Church, the flames. Ecclesiastical logic was hardly lost on the multitudes that gathered in the Rocio, or the Terriero do Passo Square, hard by the royal palace, to witness heretics, dissenters, humanists, and converted Jews suspected of practicing the old religion burn at the stake. Ever since the Holy Office of the Inquisition was established in Portugal in 1536 as a bulwark of the Counter-Reformation, the odor of sanctity had been tinged with that of burning human flesh, and the effect made for a singularly submissive flock. The impetus to orthodoxy had less to do with freedom of conscience than with a legitimate fear of falling into the clutches of the Inquisition. And so it was that by mid-morning on November 1st, 1755, with a peal of church bells beckoning the faithful, the tangled streets of Lisbon were teeming with crowds bound for their devotions. All Saints was a solemn observance in the liturgical calendar, and the ways of mammon were put to rest for the day. There was little activity on the habitually teeming quays. The Casa da India, seat of Portugal's international commerce and trade, was shuttered, as were the Customs Exchange and the British Factory, where members of Lisbon's thriving British merchant class gathered to press their business, sip intemperate quantities of port, complain of the ensuing bouts of gout, and calculate their windfalls. Shops and emporiums were likewise closed. In a country renowned as a bastion of Catholic orthodoxy, the central public act of the day was, predictably, Holy Mass. The city's elite grandees, lesser nobles, government ministers, dignitaries of the church, and foreign ambassadors took to the streets in elegant horse-drawn coaches, or were carried in sedan chairs borne by slaves so as to avoid the havoc of the rabble and the grime and open sewers of Lisbon's medieval lanes. Naturally, the commoners were on foot. The choice of which church to attend was customarily confined to one's parish, but on All Saints' Day many of Lisbon's citizens chose to pay homage to Vincent, the city's patron saint, and made their way to the Basilica of São Vicente de Fora on the eastern edge of the capital. The original church had been built in the 12th century to commemorate the reconquest of Lisbon from the Moors, but an entirely new edifice, begun in 1582 and designed by the architects Juan de Herrera and Filippo Terzi, was projected in an Italianate Mannerist style. With its gleaming white marble two-story facade and imposing twin bell towers crowned by lantern turrets, the church was one of the grandest in all of Lisbon. Inside, the single nave, expansive transept, and deep main chapel were reminiscent of the Jesuits' Church of the Gesù in Rome, all architectural power employed to stir the counter-Reformation emotions of a militant faith. For All Saints the pews were packed. There was standing room only in the aisles and side chapels, and the crowd spilled down the steps of the entrance and into the church square. All were turned out in their church-going best, each in accordance with his or her condition. The priests and their attendants at the high altar wore immaculate white vestments for the solemn feast. In the front pews, reserved for the patrician class and assorted dignitaries, there was a flourish of lace and silk, brocade and velvet finery, and noble domes crowned by powdered wigs. The legal elite and the well-to-do merchant families who followed were scarcely less adorned than their titled betters. Shopkeepers and guildmen and their families wore more sensible attire, and refrained from the pretensions of the wig. All the women were veiled. At the rear of the church stood the soiled and threadbare throng. The air was ripe with incense and the collective drone of prayers. Light streamed into the nave through clerestory windows, and dim votive candles and lanterns filled in the shadows. In the choir, the priests had just begun their sonorous chant of the introit, Gaudiamus omnis in Domino Deum festum, when the whole church began to pitch and sway like a ship tossed in a tempest. The great bronze bells in the twin towers rang in violent fits, their chimes muddled and flat below the deafening roar of seizing earth. Candles toppled and snuffed, stained glass shattered, saints were knocked from their pedestals, and priests and parishioners alike panicked. Dozens were crushed by falling timber and a rain of marble, as columns, capitals, arches, buttresses, and massive blocks of stone crumbled. Many rushed to escape to open ground, but some refused to abandon the church and frantically prayed and begged for divine forgiveness amid the turmoil, convinced that the end, the long-heralded apocalypse, was at hand. Those who did make it outside found the square enveloped in a cloud of dust and as dark as a moonless night. Whole blocks of houses had been reduced to rubble, chasms had swallowed lanes, and landslides had smothered alleys. Carriages lay wrecked, their horses writhing in agony, and Lisboans wandered half-crazed and helpless among the dead and dying. The cumulative cries of terror and the wailing of the injured, many caught half-buried in the debris, seemed scarcely human. Lisbon was still reeling from the initial tremor when, several minutes after the earthquake began at approximately 9:30 a.m., a second, far more acute shock struck. Many of the more stalwart edifices of stone and marble, such as palaces, churches, and government buildings, had survived the first shock, but their foundations had been undermined. The second shock wave brought them down like houses of cards. Surrounded by a labyrinth of ruin, no one knew where to turn. Darkness obscured the route to open ground, and mountains of rubble, some several stories tall, blocked most escapes. An account in an anonymous letter by an English witness described the fate of those caught in the calamity. You may guess at the prodigious havoc by the single instance I am going to mention. There was a high arched passage like one of our city gates fronting the west door of the ancient cathedral. On the left was the famous church of St. Anthony, and on the right some private houses several stories high. At the first shock, numbers of people, who were then passing under the arch, fled into the center of the area. Those in the two churches, as many as could possibly get out, did the same. At this instant the arched gateway, with the fronts of the two churches and the two contiguous buildings, all inclining one towards the other with the violence of the shock, fell down and buried every soul as they were standing there crowded together. Even for many of those lucky enough to have survived the initial earthquake, the harrowing experience and trauma of the disaster were as close to a near-death experience as one could come. Thomas Chase, a 26-year-old British merchant who was born in Lisbon, was in his fourth-floor bedroom when the first shock struck. Every stone in the walls separating each from the other, and grinding, as did all the walls of the other houses, one against the other, with a variety of different motions, made the most dreadful jumbling noise ears ever heard. The adjoining wall of Mr. Goddard's room fell first, then followed all the upper part of his house, and of every other as far as I could see towards the castle. When, turning my eyes quick to the front of the room, for I thought the whole city was sinking into the earth, I saw the tops of two of the pillars meet, and I saw no more. I had resolved to throw myself upon the floor, but suppose I did, but just as if waking from a dream with confused ideas, I found my mouth stuffed full of something, which with my left hand I strove to get out, and not being able to breathe freely, struggled till my head was quite disencumbered from the rubbish. Chase managed to free himself from the rubble, but he was injured, in shock, and trapped in a maze of ruins. I remained in a state of stupefaction till the still falling tiles and rubbish made me seek for shelter under a small arch in the narrow wall opposite my head. As I lay at the bottom of this, there appeared to be a little hole quite through it. Upon my approach, and with difficulty dragging myself out of the rubbish, I found the aperture to be much larger than I had imagined it was, and getting in my head and arm first, by degrees pulled my whole body after, and fell about 2 feet into a small dark place arched over at the top, which I supposed to be only a support for the two walls. till feeling about I found on one side a narrow passage, which led me round a place like an oven into a little room, where stood a Portuguese man covered with dust, who, the moment he saw me coming that way, started back, and crossed himself all over, cried out, as the custom is when much surprised, "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph! Who are you? Where do you come from?" Which being informed of, he placed me in a chair.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?